Welcome back to Guided by Faith. I'm Jay Holland, and I think we've got a great episode to walk through today. Let me ask you something personal as we get started. How strongly would you have to believe something to be willing to die for it? Now take it a step further. Would you die for something that you knew absolutely to be a lie? Like, would you die for something that you were 100% sure was not true, that it was just an absolute lie? So that's a critical question when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, because while you and I are in the category Jesus talked about when he said, "Blessed are those who have not yet seen and yet have believed." The original eyewitnesses did see, and they didn't just believe, they were willing to suffer and die rather than deny that Jesus was actually still buried. Every single one of them who gave their testimony was willing to suffer and die, and most of them did die pretty brutal deaths for this testimony. So let's take a step back for a moment and compare how this looks from a historical lens. So when we consider ancient history, most people never question the life of Alexander the Great. But here's something really surprising. The two main biographies we have of Alexander were written by Plutarch and Arrian, more than 300 years after his death. So we take what they say is pretty solid, pretty strong evidence for how his life actually went. And again, they were written more than 300 years after his death. Or take Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Many of us have heard of Caesar Augustus. His most famous biography, written by Suetonius, I think that's how you say his name, came about 90 years after Augustus died. So now let's compare that with the New Testament. When you think of the Bible, most of the time we think of the Bible as a book, but in reality, it's a library. It's not just a book, it's a collection of books, letters, different documents, and we need to look at it as such. And the New Testament in specifically contains 27 different letters written by at least 9 different authors, all within the first century. Now remember, Jesus rose again somewhere around AD 30 to AD 33, somewhere in that time. And the New Testament letters were written just decades. Some of the pieces were written even just years after the resurrection. They were circulated while the eyewitnesses were all still alive to confirm or challenge what was written. And every single one of these writings proclaims this: Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose again. Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose again. Every single New Testament letter attests to these things. And the authors weren't just anonymous fanboys. They were diverse people deeply connected to the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. So think about, and most of them you can get from the titles of the books, but Matthew, John, Peter, these were direct disciples of Jesus. They lived with Jesus for 3 years. They walked with him. They talked with him. They were very close with him. They watched him die. Most of them were committed, thinking that they were willing to die with Jesus, but then he died and they scattered and ran. And they even wrote in their testimonies of how terrified they were, how they fell short, how they betrayed. And yet they all wrote massive documents. Matthew wrote Matthew. John wrote John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation. Peter wrote 1 and 2 Peter. And they all attest with their lives that Jesus rose from the dead. Mark was closely associated with Peter. Most people think that he wrote down Peter's testimony, that the book of Mark is probably based on Peter's preaching. But he was alive during the time of Jesus, during the resurrection of Jesus, and was writing down this stuff as Peter was traveling and preaching. Luke was a beloved physician and historian. Interestingly, he's not a Jew. The others that I'm mentioning are Jews. Luke was a Gentile who carefully investigated everything, interviewed many people, many eyewitnesses, and kind of the book of Luke and Acts are really an anthology of his eyewitness accounts, or his collection of eyewitness accounts from many different people, many different sources, but again, all written within the lifetime of people who would have been there to witness the crucifixion and resurrection. And then the most radical of all, you've got Paul. Paul was a former persecutor of Christians who hated the way of Jesus. But then he had an experience where he met the resurrected Jesus, and it radically changed his life, where instead of becoming a persecutor for the rest of his life, he was a missionary. And here's what you need to understand. A lot of people say that like the Bible was written and the church started so that people get power. But these men did not get power. They did not get rich. They weren't praised. They were hunted, beaten, imprisoned, and nearly every one of them executed for this claim. Not one of them recanted. Not one of them said, we made it up. We're sorry. We shouldn't have done this. Now, I want you to imagine yourself in a courtroom right now. And you're trying, let's say you're a jury member, and you have been told some extraordinary event happened. And you're trying to figure out, is this true or not? So what's the evidence? Now, I want you to imagine that you have multiple sworn testimonies, affidavits from different people written independently of one another. Some of the witnesses were friends of the defendant. Others were enemies of the defendant before the event happened. Every single one of them is willing to go to death row for the testimony they're given, and they're not going to recant whatsoever. They are happy to die rather than go back on their testimony. Friends of the person and enemies of the person. So that's what we have in these resurrection accounts. Not blind faith, not hearsay, but eyewitness testimony written down multiple times across time and geography and sealed with the blood of Jesus. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on one particular group of eyewitnesses that we did not talk about today, the brothers of Jesus, because something happened that changed their lives radically. You know, we'll ask the question, and it's a good one to finish today on. What would it take to convince you that your brother or sister was God? Because something happened to convince James and Jude of this very thing. So I want you to remember today as we finish out, the eyewitness testimonies across various people are strong evidence that Jesus truly rose from the dead, especially because they were written when all of the witnesses were still alive. They were written by people who were close to Jesus, people who hated Jesus, and people who were very in between. And yet they were all willing to give this testimony and die for this testimony because they believed it to be true, because they had seen and experienced and touched the resurrected Jesus.